March 1947. The Pacific War was supposed to be over for 18 months. On a speck of jungle-covered rock somewhere between Guam and the Philippines, a squad of U.S. Marines moved in single file along a narrow, muddy trail. The air felt like hot, wet wool against their skin. Mosquitoes whined. Boots sank into red clay. Sergeant Tom Ellison wiped sweat from his eyes and pushed aside a curtain of vines. He'd been in the Pacific since '43. Tarawa, Saipan, Okinawa. He thought he knew every sound a jungle could make, until he heard that one, metal faint, a rattle like a rifle sling brushing a canteen. He froze. "Hold," he whispered, fist up. The squad stopped as one. Behind him, Private Russell muttered a quiet curse. Somewhere above, a bird screeched, startled into flight. Then the jungle went very, very still. Tom scanned the trees. At first he saw nothing, just trunks slick with moss, ferns trembling in the breeze, the rusted skeleton of an old Japanese supply dump half swallowed by vines. Then he saw the eyes. Two dark circles in a dirt-streaked face, half hidden behind a fallen log. A helmet sat crooked on tangled black hair. A faded khaki uniform clung to a frame so thin it barely seemed strong enough to stand. But the rifle in his hands was steady. Type 99 Arisaka, bayonet fixed. The Japanese soldier rose slowly from the undergrowth like a ghost, knees shaking, barrel leveled at Tom's chest. His lips moved. The words were hoarse, cracked, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Yankee, do not move. I am Imperial Japanese Army," Russo hissed. "Jesus, Sarge, he didn't get the memo," Tom's heart thudded. The war was over. Everyone knew that. Papers had been signed. Flags had changed. Tokyo had been in American hands for a year. But this man, this walking skeleton with a rifle and a stare like broken glass, he clearly hadn't heard, or he refused to believe it. Tom raised his hands slowly, the jungle pressing in around them like a held breath. Because the question suddenly wasn't just who would shoot first. It was something far stranger. How do you tell a man the war he's still willing to die for ended 2 years ago? To understand what that moment meant, you have to rewind the tape. Back to the last year of the Pacific War. Back to the islands where the jungle swallowed men whole. By late 1944, the Japanese Empire was bleeding. Carriers sunk, cities burning, lines collapsing. But in the caves and ridges of places like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, a different war still raged. It was a war of orders whispered like prayers. No surrender, ever. For Japanese infantry, it wasn't just strategy. It was identity. From the moment they shaved their heads and stepped into barracks, they were told that surrender was worse than death. That capture meant shame for their families. That the emperor was not just a sovereign but something close to divine. They were given slogans to live by. Duty heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. To Tom Ellison and the other Marines, these weren't just words. They were the reason nights on the line never really ended. Even when the shooting stopped, no one slept deeply, because they had seen what no surrender looked like in the dark. Banzai charges. Men with bayonets screaming as they ran straight into machine gun fire. Others who waited in spider holes, letting entire squads pass before firing into their backs. Civilians driven off cliffs rather than taken prisoner. On Saipan, Tom had watched a Japanese officer raise a pistol to his own head the moment his bunker was overrun. No hesitation, just a pencil-thin flash, a body crumpling. The war was full of those flashes. So when August 1945 came, and with it the Emperor's crackling radio voice admitting defeat, it felt unreal. Tom had been on Okinawa then, battle-scarred, down to his last nerves. One minute they were trading artillery with dug-in positions. The next, orders rolled down the line, cease fire. Hostilities ended. Japan has surrendered. Men laughed. Men cried. Some just stared at their rifles like they were suddenly relics. But the jungle didn't care about newspapers or broadcasts. Radios failed. Leaflets drifted into ravines. On some islands, garrisons never saw the white flags. On others, they saw them and assumed it was a trick. Even when food ran out, even when the occasional American patrol shouted, "The war is over," through bullhorns, many Japanese soldiers clung to their training. It was safer to believe in honorable death than in enemy mercy. For Tom, the war after the war felt strange. One day he was charging pillboxes. The next he was on garrison duty, walking past rows of surrendered Japanese soldiers who bowed stiffly as he passed. Some nights, though, he'd look up at the black line of jungle on the hills and wonder, who was still out there? What did they think, watching American flags rise where imperial ones had flown? He heard the stories long before he met the man. Stories of ghost soldiers living off roots and rainwater, of rifles that still cracked at night, a single shot into nothing, of footprints around supply dumps that no one could trace. Most of the Marines dismissed it as island gossip, but deep down they knew. The war might be over for governments, for generals. For some men, though, it was far from finished. And that's where this story really begins. The island didn't even have a proper name on their maps, just a designation, a string of letters and numbers, a dot halfway to nowhere. Tom's unit had been sent there in late '46. Not to fight, not officially. Their job was to maintain a small airstrip, watch the shipping lanes, and make sure the stars and stripes stayed politely visible on the edge of the Pacific. Babysitting duty, Russell had called it, dropping his duffel in the sand. From Tarawa to this, we've really climbed the ladder, huh, Sarge? Tom didn't argue. Part of him was grateful for the quiet. No more pre-dawn bombardments. No more casualty lists read under a tent lamp. The island was familiar in the way all Pacific islands were familiar. A sugar-white beach sloping up to a fringe of palms. Beyond that, a wall of jungle that seemed to breathe. Cicadas screaming in the heat. Birds flashing like tossed coins between branches. At night, the sky so thick with stars it looked like someone had spilled salt on black velvet. It would have been beautiful if not for the ghosts. The old Japanese camp sat inland, near a stream. Rusted helmets lay half-buried in mud. A broken field gun pointed at nothing. Charred beams marked where huts had stood. Every so often, one of the Marines would kick up a spent cartridge, or the corner of a photograph eaten by mold. "Feels like the party ended and no one bothered to clean up," Russo muttered on their first patrol. Tom had just grunted in reply. They had a routine: patrol the perimeter, check the wire, inspect the ammo dumps, keep an eye on the locals. There weren't many, just a few fishing families who'd crept back after the shelling stopped. Life settled into a rhythm of heat, chores, and boredom, until the rice went missing. It started small, a bag here, a handful there. At first they blamed rats or sloppy bookkeeping. The quartermaster was always complaining that the numbers didn't add up. Then they found the footprints. They were faint, barefoot, small. "Could be kids," one of the Marines suggested, squatting by the prints. Tom shook his head. "Kids don't cut wire this clean." Someone had sliced through the perimeter near the old Japanese camp. In the mud they found something else. A scrap of cloth, once khaki, now stained and frayed. Japanese issue. The officers held a meeting that night in the mess tent. A fan squeaked overhead, pushing hot air in circles. Cigarette smoke curled toward the canvas ceiling. "We've had reports of stragglers on other islands," the co said, tapping ash into a mug. "Men who never got the surrender order or refused it. Whatever this is, we need to handle it carefully." A lieutenant scoffed. "Carefully, sir, with respect. If there's one Jap left out there, we send a squad, flush him, and be done with it. Or he ambushes your squad and we get letters from Washington asking why Marines are still dying on islands that surrendered 2 years ago," the co replied, voice flat. The room fell quiet. Tom listened, jaw tight. They'd all seen what one determined man with a rifle could do in thick cover. The war had taught them that the jungle was the perfect equalizer. It didn't care who had the better navy when the fight came down to 20 yards and a heartbeat. "We're not here to start the war again," the co continued. "We're here to keep it finished. So here's the plan." The plan sounded simple on paper. Step 1. Confirm it wasn't just locals pilfering supplies. Step 2, if it was a Japanese holdout, try to make contact. Drop leaflets in Japanese. Use loudspeakers to broadcast the emperor's surrender speech. Give him a chance to come in. Only if that failed would they send in a full search party. Tom left the tent with orders ringing in his ears. He lit a cigarette, staring at the dark silhouette of the jungle. "So what, we're gonna talk him down?" Russo asked, joining him. "Maybe," Tom said. "Maybe he's just waiting for someone to tell him it's all right to stop." Russo snorted. "You really think he'll believe a bunch of leathernecks he's been trained to hate since boot camp?" Tom watched fireflies blink over the tree line. "I don't know what he'll believe," he said quietly. "All I know is this. If we screw this up and somebody gets killed, every paper back home is gonna ask why we let a war ghost pull the trigger." The next morning, they started seeing signs. A fresh-cut branch where no one had patrolled. A can moved from one rock to another. The smell of smoke on a breeze that shouldn't have carried any. The island, which had seemed empty, suddenly felt inhabited, not by ghosts, by someone watching, someone listening. Someone who hadn't decided yet whether the men on the beach were liberators, occupiers, or targets. And in that thin, dangerous space between misunderstanding and bloodshed, Tom realized something. This wasn't just a military problem. It was a human one. If they couldn't reach this man, whoever he was, then all the treaties in the world wouldn't matter, because for him the war would still be blazing, and he'd be fighting it alone. The first attempt was clumsy. They hiked up to a small clearing near the old Japanese camp. The ground there was churned, trampled long ago by boots that never came back. Tom's squad cleared a space, swatting at flies as they worked. From a battered crate, the lieutenant pulled out a bundle of leaflets. Thin paper, printed in Tokyo before the surrender, reprinted in Guam afterward. The same text had been dropped from planes over 100 different islands. Tom took one and scanned it. "To the honorable soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army," it began. "Your emperor has ended the war. Lay down your arms. You will be treated with humanity." He remembered seeing one flutter down on Okinawa, tumbling past shell bursts and tracer fire. No one had paid it much attention then. Now the paper felt heavier. "Spread 'em around," the lieutenant ordered. "Make it obvious." They pinned some to trees with bayonets, weighted others with stones. The wind caught a few, sending them skittering into the undergrowth like pale, fragile animals. Then came the loudspeaker. It was an ugly metal box wired to a Jeep battery and a reel-to-reel recorder. A Marine radio operator fussed with dials until static settled into a low hum. "Got the broadcast tape from HQ," he said. "Straight from 45. Emperor's voice and everything." Tom took a step back as the first crackling words rolled out. It was bizarre hearing that high, almost reedy voice echo through a Pacific jungle. When the speech had first played across Japan, it had shattered decades of myth. A living god admitting defeat. Out here it sounded distant, ghostly. They let the message play, Japanese syllables rising and falling on the heavy air. Somewhere in the trees, a bird shrieked and took off. Russo muttered, "If I was him, I'd think we were messing with his head." "That's exactly what we are doing," the lieutenant replied. "We're trying to mess him out of shooting at us." They repeated the broadcast 3 times, then left. For 3 days, nothing happened. No shots, no footprints, no missing supplies. The jungle went back to being just jungle. "Maybe he packed up and swam to Tokyo," Russo said on patrol. "Or maybe there never was anyone." Then the rice vanished again. This time, whoever took it left something behind. On top of the empty sack, folded with the care of a man who still believed in ceremonies, lay a strip of cloth. The rising sun of the old war flag, its red rays faded but unmistakable. Tom picked it up carefully. "Message received," he murmured. The lieutenant swore. "He's poking us. We give him a chance to come in, he answers by raiding supplies like it's business as usual." Pressure started to build. From above, HQ wanted results. From below, the men were getting jumpy. Nobody likes the idea of some ghost nip watching them take a leak, Miller, one of the corporals, muttered. Sooner or later, someone's gonna start shooting shadows. Tom felt the strain, too. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. But there was someone else feeling pressure in a different way. Lance Corporal Higa. He was Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American. Short, wiry, eyes calm behind wire-rimmed glasses. He joined the Marines to prove a point, to fight for a country that had put people like his parents behind barbed wire in the desert. Now, he was the only man on the island who could speak fluent Japanese. One evening, under the yellow light of a tent bulb, the Ko slid a photograph across a folding table toward Higa. A Japanese family, parents in formal clothes, two small boys in matching uniforms, standing ramrod straight. Intel pulled this from Tokyo, the Ko said. We think our man up there might be Private Kenji Morita. Last recorded unit matches the garrison that held this island. We got lucky, someone in his hometown kept a record. This is his family. Higa studied the picture. You want me to talk to him, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I want you to get through to him, the Ko replied. We try force, this goes sideways fast. We try patience, maybe he listens to you. And if he does, Higa asked. The Ko's eyes hardened. Then we do what Marines do. So the second attempt began. This time it wasn't just leaflets and loudspeakers, it was a voice. They hiked back into the jungle, to a rocky outcrop overlooking a ravine. Intel thought Kenji's hideout might be somewhere below. Higa stepped to the edge, cupped his hands around his mouth, and started calling out. Morita Kenji, he shouted in Japanese. Private Morita Kenji, this is not a trick. I am Japanese-American. I speak your language. Your emperor has ordered you to lay down your arms. The words echoed off the trees, bounced back, lost in leaves. He tried again. He talked about Tokyo, about the broadcast, about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about the occupation, about factories turning out pots instead of shells. Then he said something else. We know your family's name, Higa called. We know your parents are alive. We know your brothers survived the bombing. They are waiting for you. Do you want them to think you vanished in the jungle like a ghost? Silence. The jungle watched. Tom stood back, rifle slung, throat tight. He could feel the weight of the moment. If there was ever going to be a crack in Kenji's resolve, this should be it. For a long time there was only the whine of insects. Then faintly a voice drifted up from the ravine. It was hoarse, suspicious. How do I know you are not lying? It called in Japanese. Higa's face flickered. Relief, fear, hope. He glanced at Tom, then stepped closer to the edge. You don't, he shouted back, voice steady. But you know this, if the war was still going, we would not be speaking like this. Another pause, then sharper. If the war is over, why are there still American soldiers here? Why do I still hear your guns? Why do you still carry rifles? Tom looked down at the weapon in his hands. It was a fair question, one they would have to answer before any man like Kenji could accept that his world had collapsed. And that answer wasn't written on any leaflet. The storm rolled in 3 days later. It came in low and ugly from the east, turning the horizon the color of bruised steel. The air went still, heavy, as if the entire sky had taken a breath and forgotten how to exhale. By nightfall, the island was a drum under a hammer. Rain hammered the roofs of the huts, sheeted off the mess hall, turned the paths into rivers. Palms bent like they were praying. The surf, usually a steady hiss, roared like artillery against the reef. Tom lay on his cot, staring at the canvas above him, listening to the storm batter the world. He wasn't thinking about Kenji. He was thinking about home, about his kid sister in Oregon, sending him letters about snow and ration lines, about his father's quiet way of cleaning his hands after coming in from the fields. Thunder cracked, close enough to rattle the metal cup by his bunk. Hell of a night, Russo muttered from the next cot. If our ghost up in the hills is still around, he's gonna be swimming in his foxhole, Tom grunted. Man picked the wrong war to stay late for. He was almost asleep when the siren wailed. It wasn't the air raid siren, those had been silent for months. It was shorter, shriller. The new one they'd put up near the depot for base security. Tom was on his feet before his brain caught up. Boots on, rifle grabbed, helmet yanked down. Outside, the rain hit like thrown gravel. Men spilled from barracks, blinking, half-dressed, weapons in hand. "What's going on?" Russo shouted over the downpour. "Depot," a runner yelled, sprinting past. "Movement at the depot, where they kept the food, the ammo, the medical supplies." Tom's gut tightened. Of all nights, this would be the one to sneak in. He pelted through the mud, squad on his heels, water slapping against his shins. The depot loomed ahead, a squat dark shape against lightning-flashed sky. An MP crouched by the entrance, rain streaming off his poncho. "We saw a shadow by the back fence," he said. "Moved fast, could be an animal, but the wires cut again." "Any shots fired?" Tom asked. "None yet." Lightning flashed, stark and white. For a heartbeat, the world was frozen in negative, palms, sandbags, faces tilted up, and in that flash Tom saw something. A figure, low and fast, darting from one stack of crates to another near the far side of the yard. "Contact," he hissed. He didn't raise his rifle. Not yet. The order from the co echoed in his head. "No one fires unless fired upon." "Spread out," Tom barked. "No one shoots unless I say so." The squad fanned into a loose semicircle, moving toward the crates. Rain rattled on their helmets, beaded on rifle stocks. Another flash of lightning. The figure became a man. For a second, Tom saw him clearly. Trousers patched with cloth from a civilian shirt, tunic hanging looser than it was ever meant to, helmet strap tied with a piece of wire. A face carved thinner by hunger but still young. Kenji Morita. He was bent over a crate lid, hands working at the rope. He looked like he was wrestling with it, breath coming in ragged gasps. Rain plastered his hair to his skull. "Kenji." Higa's voice came from behind Tom, raw and loud. "Stop!" Kenji's head snapped up. For one electric moment, every weapon pointed at him. His eyes flashed from one shadowy shape to another. He saw the rifles, the helmets, the silhouettes against the lightning. He jerked back, twisting, rifle coming up. Time contorted. Tom felt his instincts roar. Dive, fire, neutralize. But something else slammed in front of that reflex like a wall. The memory of a boy's voice from the ravine, suspicious, scared. "How do I know you are not lying?" Tom did something his training would never have recommended. He stepped forward, out of cover, into the open. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and lifted both hands high. Behind him, he heard Russell swear in disbelief. "Tom, what the hell?" "Hold your fire," Tom shouted. "That's an order." The words came out as more of a growl than he intended. Lightning flashed again. Thunder strobed overhead. Kenji froze, rifle aimed square at Tom's chest. For the first time, they saw each other clearly at close range. Tom saw the way Kenji's fingers trembled against the trigger. The way his cheeks were hollowed into sharp planes. The way mud streaked his uniform, filling old bullet holes with dirt. Kenji saw a tall, broad-shouldered Marine with tired eyes. No hatred in them, just hardness and something like resolve. Higa stepped up beside Tom slowly, hands also raised. "Morita," he shouted in Japanese, voice straining over the storm. "Listen to me. The war is over. You are surrounded by men who do not want to kill you." Kenji's eyes flicked to him, then back to Tom. "If war is over," he shouted back, throat raw, "why do you still carry guns? Why do you still watch us? Why did my comrades never return?" His voice cracked on the last word. It wasn't just accusation, it was grief. Tom's heart hammered. He knew he was one twitch away from a shot that would throw them all back into 1944. "Higa," he said quietly, eyes never leaving Kenji. "Tell him this. Tell him I've lost men too, brothers, friends. The war took them and never gave them back. But if he pulls that trigger now, the only thing he proves is that the war still owns him." Higa swallowed, then translated, word for word, into Japanese. Kenji's mouth tightened. Rain ran down his face, tracing pale paths through the dirt. Lightning strobed again. In that flash, Tom saw something unexpected, not fanaticism, exhaustion. Kenji was swaying. His knees bent too far with every shift of weight. His lips were cracked. When he swallowed, it looked painful. He was starving. Tom made another decision. "Russo," he called over his shoulder. "My pack, the K-ration, now." Russo hesitated. "Sarge, now," rustling, a crinkle of waxed cardboard, then a shove at Tom's side. He took the ration box and very slowly held it out toward Kenji, not like a bribe, like an offering. Higa's voice rose again. "Morita, he is giving you food, no tricks, no guns." For a moment nothing happened. Then Kenji's rifle wavered just a fraction. But in that tiny tremor a lifetime of drilled-in resolve cracked. He stared at the box, nostrils flaring. To a man who'd been scavenging for roots and rats, the smell must have hit like a fist. Cheese, meat, biscuits, sugar, lightning flickered, thunder rolled. "You think this is trap?" Kenji shouted, softer now. "You want me alive to shame me, to parade me, to show my weakness." Tom shook his head. "Higa," he said, "tell him we all lost, all of us. You, me, nobody gets out of a war clean, but we don't have to keep feeding it." Higa translated, voice rough. The words hung between them. For the first time, Kenji's eyes shifted from Tom's face to Tom's hands, to the box. He swallowed. Then in a voice that was suddenly very small, he asked a question. "Is Emperor alive?" Higa's answer was immediate. "Yes, he lives, but he is no longer a god. He told everyone to stop fighting, to go home if they can." Lightning flashed again, farther away now. Kenji lowered his rifle 2 inches. Tom felt every Marine behind him tighten, prepared to react either way. The storm began to ease, rain thinning. In that softened curtain, the depot yard became something else. Not a battlefield, just a ring of tired men standing in the rain, watching another man decide whether he wanted to keep dying for a war that had moved on without him. Kenji took a step forward, then another. His rifle barrel dropped little by little until it pointed at the mud. He stopped a few feet from Tom. Up close, Tom could see the lice crawling at the edge of his collar, the patches sewn with clumsy stitches, the faint, shaking anger in his jaw. Kenji stared at the ration box like it was a sin. Then with a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a curse, he let go of his rifle. It slid from his grip and thudded into the mud. Every Marine flinched. No one reached for it. Kenji's shoulders sagged. His hands, empty now, moved very slowly toward the ration box. Tom extended it the last inch. Cold, dirty fingers closed around it. For a heartbeat, their hands touched. Kenji's skin was ice cold despite the heat. Tom felt the tremor running through him like a live wire. Then Kenji crumpled. The box stayed clutched to his chest as his legs folded. He went down on his knees in the mud, head bowed, shoulders shaking. Not in a formal surrender, in collapse. Like a man who'd been holding up a sky only he could see and finally stepped out from under it. Higa moved first, kneeling beside him, speaking softly in Japanese. The words were lost in the rain, but the tone was unmistakable. Not gloating, comfort. Tom gestured to the others. "Weapons down," he said. "All of them. He doesn't see another gun pointed at him tonight. Not one." One by one, rifles lowered. The depot yard, only minutes before a hair-trigger powder keg, became something quieter. A place where a war that had ended on paper in 1945 finally ended for one man in 1947. With a ration box, with a dropped rifle, with a decision to live. They didn't throw him in a cage. Tom had half expected that. Metal bars, a guard detail, reports stamped and filed. That was how the military liked to handle anything that didn't fit neatly on a checklist. Instead, they put Kenji in the infirmary. He lay on a narrow cot under a ceiling fan that barely moved the humid air. His uniform, now stiff with dried mud and torn in a dozen places, hung over a chair. A bottle of delousing powder stood at the foot of the bed like a sentry. He slept for almost 20 hours. The corpsman said it wasn't just exhaustion. His body had been running on fumes, malnutrition, dehydration, parasites. A bullet grazed on his calf that had festered and then healed badly. Another month out there, he'd have died, the corpsman muttered, checking a pulse. Not from a bullet, just from the jungle slowly eating him. When Kenji finally woke, eyes fluttering open, it was to the soft buzz of the fan and the faint clatter of mess kits outside. He stirred, hand groping instinctively at his side for a rifle that wasn't there. Higa was sitting in a folding chair by the cot, a book of English phrases open on his lap. He closed it gently. "You're on an American base," he said in Japanese. "You're not a prisoner of war. The war is over. You surrendered." Kenji blinked up at the ceiling. "I remember," he rasped. "Rain, food, marine," with tired eyes. Higa smiled faintly. "That would be Sergeant Ellison." When Tom came in later, Kenji's gaze tracked him immediately. For a moment, neither man spoke. Tom felt awkward. He'd faced men in hand-to-hand combat, shouted orders over artillery, written letters to mothers explaining how their boys had died. But walking into a room to speak with someone he'd once been trained to kill felt different. "Hey," he said finally, feeling how blunt the word sounded. Higa translated. Kenji nodded stiffly. On the bedside table sat the empty K-ration box folded with care. Like the rising sun cloth he'd once left on the rice sack, he'd turned it into an offering of sorts. "How long?" Tom asked. Higa translated. Kenji thought for a moment, counting silently on his fingers. "Since August of Showa 20, he said. Higa did the math. "Since the Emperor's broadcast. He doesn't remember the day exactly. He remembers the bombing stopped. The radio went quiet, but his officer told him it was a trick." "A trick," Tom repeated. Kenji's voice grew steadier as he spoke. "Their unit had been ordered to hold the island to the last man. When the American attack stopped, their commanding officer gathered them in a cave. He told them that the silence meant the enemy was preparing something worse, that leaflets were lies, that any voice claiming the war was over was a coward's or an enemy's. Better to die in the Emperor's service than live as a traitor," he'd said. Most of them believed. They hid in the hills, living off whatever they could find. Some tried to swim to neighboring islands and never returned. Others walked deeper into the jungle and vanished. Only Kenji stayed, not because he was braver. Because by then he was too afraid to choose any other path. "What were you waiting for?" Tom asked quietly. Kenji swallowed. "For the order," he said. "The one that said it was all right to live." The words landed heavier than any artillery shell. Days turned into weeks in the infirmary, then into a different kind of routine. Kenji got stronger. He ate carefully at first, doctors watching to make sure his starved stomach didn't rebel. He traded halting phrases of English with Higa, repeating words like home and ship and end. Some Marines kept their distance. Too many ghosts between them and the man in the Japanese uniform. Others drifted in out of curiosity. Russo, of course, was the first. He stood at the foot of the bed, arms folded, eyes narrowed. "So this is the guy who's been making me run night patrols extra months," he said. Kenji didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He tensed. Higa translated loosely. Russo sighed. Then, to Tom's surprise, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and wrapped in paper. Chocolate. He tossed it onto the blanket. "For services rendered," he muttered. Kenji stared at it, then at Russo. Slowly he unwrapped it. The smell hit him like a memory from a life he'd never lived. He took a tiny bite, eyes widening. For a moment he looked younger, almost boyish. Tom watched something loosen in Russo's shoulders. The rest of the unit took their cue. They started talking about Kenji less like a ghost and more like a man. "Guy survived on roots and rainwater for 2 years, Miller said one night, stirring his coffee. "Takes a special kind of stubborn to do that." "Same kind that kept us on those damn beaches," Russo admitted reluctantly. "Just on the other side of the rifle." Paperwork began to move. War was over, but the machinery of repatriation was still grinding. Lists of former POWs, manifests of ships, quotas of who got sent home when. Kenji's name, once just a line in a lost garrison report, now sat on a new list. Morita Kenji, former private, to be transported to Japan on U.S. Navy vessel as soon as feasible. One afternoon, the Co called Tom into his tent. "He trusts you," the Co said, lighting a cigarette. "You were there when he came in, you saw the whole thing. I want you to escort him onto the ship when it's time." Tom shifted. "Sir, with respect, any of the men can." "I want you," the Co repeated, "because this isn't just about shipping one former enemy home. It's about making sure the last shot of this war doesn't echo in our heads any longer than it has to." 2 weeks later, the ship arrived. It wasn't a battleship, just a gray, practical transport anchored off the reef, its hull streaked with rust. But to Kenji, seeing it from the back of the jeep, it might as well have been a portal. He wore a clean set of clothes supplied by the Marines, ill-fitting khaki trousers, a plain shirt. His old uniform, carefully folded, sat in a canvas bag at his feet. On the beach, he hesitated. The gangway stretched from sand to ship like a narrow path across water. American sailors moved back and forth, shouting to each other. A crane creaked in the salt air. Tom stood beside him. "You ready?" he asked. Higa translated. Kenji looked out over the water. "In the cave," he said slowly, "we used to imagine this walk. Only in our dreams the ship was taking us to another island to fight. Not home." He looked at Tom. "I do not know," he admitted, "what waits for me there. Maybe my family, maybe only ruins, maybe nothing." Tom thought of Oregon, of the farm, of his own fear of going back to a place that had stayed still while he'd changed. "None of us know," he said, "but it's better than the alternative." Higa translated with care. Kenji nodded. He stepped onto the gangway. Halfway up he stopped again, turned, he bowed. It wasn't the sharp, rigid bow of a soldier to a superior. It was deeper, slower, gratitude, apology, a farewell between men who'd once been required to hate each other. Tom felt his throat go tight. He raised a hand in a half-salute, half-wave. "Safe trip, Kenji," he said. Higa translated softly. Kenji smiled, awkward, thin, but real. Then he turned and walked up the gangway until he disappeared against the gray of the ship. The war had sent them crashing into each other's lives with rifles and fear. Now, peacetime was sending them away from each other with paperwork and silence. But something fundamental had shifted. For Tom, the enemy would never again be a faceless silhouette on a ridge line. It would be a man with hollow cheeks and shaking hands, waiting for permission to believe he was allowed to live. For Kenji, the American would never again be just a shape in a propaganda poster. It would be a sergeant standing in the rain, holding out a box of food instead of firing a bullet. And for the thousands of other holdouts still scattered across the islands, each story like this one made it easier to step out of the shadows. Because somewhere out there, on both sides, men were slowly learning that there had to be an end, not just to the shooting, but to the idea that you had to die to prove you had been loyal. Years later, Tom Ellison would sit on the porch of a small house in Oregon and listen to the rain. It sounded different from Pacific storms, softer, cooler, but sometimes when it hit the roof just right, it pulled him back to that depot yard on the island, to lightning flashing on a trembling rifle barrel, to a ration box held out like a truce. The world moved on. New wars, new headlines, new enemies drawn in fresh ink on new maps. Most people never heard of Private Kenji Morita. His name didn't appear in textbooks or on memorials or in documentaries. But Tom remembered. He remembered that for one man, the war had lasted 2 years longer than any treaty said it should, and that it hadn't ended with a grand surrender or a victory parade. It had ended with a choice: to feed instead of shoot, to open hands instead of closing them around a trigger. If there is one sentence that survives from their story, it might be this: a war truly ends not when governments say it does, but when the last frightened soldier is told he is allowed to live. Tom would close his eyes, listening to the rain fade. And somewhere across an ocean, an old man on a Japanese shore might be doing the same. Two former enemies, living in the quiet their younger selves had never believed they'd see. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.